So, isn't the level of disparity also a function of the system in the nation, system of governance? For example, I would guess various Western European countries, Norway, for example, Sweden, their taxation system ensures there's a less level of disparity than there is in the United States.
It's flatter. It's flatter, but not gone
And same thing in Canada too.
to some degree. Yeah, Canada would sort of stand midway between the Scandinavian countries and the US. But it's also possible that smaller and more homogeneous countries, and I would say there's good evidence supporting this claim, is that it's easier for smaller and more homogeneous countries to put in place tax policies, for example, that flatten out disparity. So maybe because it becomes increasingly complicated to do so as your country becomes larger and larger, but also because people are more willing to share equitably with those with whom they feel like a cultural identity. And
Well,
so-
one would argue that a system of authority like they have in China, over 25 years, worse, 25, 30 years ago, before they embraced a form of capitalism, their form of capitalism, there were 90% Chinese population was at poverty level.
Mhm.
And it's reversed now. They're only less than 10%.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's absolutely unbelievable transformation.
And they don't have the market capitalism system that the Western world does. But they accomplished that, with the sense of, authoritative.
Well, I would say that they have enough of it so that allied with the Chinese proclivity to work exceptionally hard, that was sufficient to launch them out of poverty. Now, so what I would say the evidence indicates that you don't have to free people up much before you get a walloping economic payoff for that. And the Chinese at least managed to do that on the economic front. And I don't think anyone disputes the fact that their rapid rise to middle class status was a consequence of introducing at least the basics of capitalist society. Now, the question is how stable that will be over the long run. We don't know, and whether or not they'll degenerate back into a counterproductive authoritarianism, because the signs for that are quite clear. We also don't understand the degree to which, I don't think that free market capitalism is sustainable in the long run without the underlying metaphysic. And the underlying metaphysic would involve the emphasis on the sovereignty and freedom of the individual. I think that, but we don't know. We don't know, and that's partly what's being played out right now, because there are relatively authoritarian countries like China that have certainly produced an economic miracle. My guess is that our institutions, first of all, the idea of that competitive and cooperative capitalism was emerged out of the underlying metaphysic of individual sovereignty and private property, all of that. And I don't think that's accidental. And then maybe once it emerges, you can graft it into a system that's essentially authoritarian in structure. But I would say, first of all, that's highly likely to modify the authoritarian structure of the system. Now, I think you do that as soon as you do such things as introduce automobiles. Because cars are very interesting when you think about them as political entities and not as means of conveyances. Because, think about a culture that would develop a car. I mean, the first idea that you need is that, you could own a car, so you need the idea of ownership. And the second is that you could use the car to go where you wanted to go as an individual, because it's an individual conveyance. It's not a bus or a train. You get to point it where you go. And so embedded in these artifacts of capitalism and the West are the presumptions of capitalism in the West. And I think they have a revolutionary impact on authoritarian societies. Now, China at many levels is still authoritarian, but it's a lot freer than it used to be. And people can drive from place to place, which is a non-trivial freedom. So, the people in Singapore, for example, might argue, well, our heavy-handed approach to governance has imposed peace and a tremendous degree of prosperity, but Singapore is a small state and hasn't been around for that long. So we'll see how they handle things like power transitions and how competitive they are in the long run. But I'd still bet on our institutions overall versus the Chinese. So we'll see. So what I've been objecting.
On the creativity scale, where would you put President Trump?
Well, he's obviously entrepreneurial. He's a creative person. You can tell that because of all the different enterprises that he's been involved in. He's moved from enterprise to enterprise and had a fair degree of success. Now, you can have a perfectly valid debate about the propriety of his success, and I don't know enough about that to be an intelligent commentator, but he was a real estate developer, and that's not particularly straightforward. And then he ran a reality TV show for a decade or so, and it was very successful. That's also not easy. Then he launched a successful presidential campaign, which is also impossible. And now he's been president for 2 years under extreme duress, which is also extremely difficult. And I'm not making a value judgment about any of that. I'm just saying that those are very diverse ranges of activity and that he's manifested a fair degree of success across them. And so that would indicate to me that he's an entrepreneurial and creative type rather than, there's two types. This is kind of an interesting thing to know as well. So a fair bit of your political outlook is determined by your temperament. Now, what you generally think is that you look at the world of facts and you draw your unbiased conclusions and you come to your political beliefs as a consequence. But that isn't actually how it works. And it isn't how it works because it can't work that way. And the reason it can't work that way is that there are too many facts. And you don't have the wherewithal or the time to sample them in an unbiased manner and to weight them properly and to draw the appropriate conclusions. And so your temperament steps in as a set of quick and dirty heuristics that help you solve problems without having to think about it a lot. Now, that doesn't mean that the conclusions you draw because of your temperament are always correct, but at least they give you the initial way of orienting yourself quite quickly in the world.